Good morning and welcome again to this year's Civil Rights and Human Rights Symposium. It is refreshing to see our students, faculty, and staff here, and just as rewarding to see members of our community supporters, many of whose courage and refusal to accept the status quo are the reasons that we can acknowledge the ways in which our nation and ultimately the world was changed by the activism of those we have celebrated this week. My name is Nyota Tucker, and I will serve as this morning's moderator for this session. And we will focus on women and civil rights with special emphasis on Black women preachers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the foundational contributions women made to key social movements of our times. It should be noted that Black women, as well as women of other ethnicities, have been agents of social change and activism in the United States and throughout the world, creating a legacy of social activism that has impacted all movements in this country. To say that women were at the forefront of the civil rights movement and largely the backbone of the grassroots movement is probably an understatement. Despite the fact that women were often denied the official leadership in the civil rights movement, the contributions, activism, sheer courage, and strategic thinking of women distinguished them as influential thought leaders and helped to shape the tactical strategies of resistance and active participation in the movement. The women of the civil rights movement had bigger-than-life role models to follow: Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Zora Neale Hurston, Mary McLeod Bethune, Madam C.J. Walker, and many others that led the way. These women refused to accept society's vision of them only as caretakers, mothers, and cooks, resigned to clerical and domestic support roles. And following in their footsteps were women who continued to break barriers and stereotypes and fuel the civil rights movement with intellect, energy, and no-nonsense courage to confront bigotry and racism head-on. Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dorothy Height, Ella Baker, Gloria Richardson, Constance Baker Motley, Elaine Brown, Angela Davis, Maya Angelou, Miriam Wright Edelman, and so many more. And the city of Albany, Baker and Terrell counties, and many of the other Southwest Georgia surrounding counties provided their own share of strong and outstanding women to the movement. Albany had its own Rosa Parks and Ola Mae Quarterman, its own Dorothy Height and Shirley Sherrod and McCree Harris, its own Constance Baker Motley and Mary Young Cummings, a brave core of student activists in Evelyn Toney, Bernice Johnson, Rutha Harris, Janie Culbreth, Annette Jones, Jeanette Sibley, and so many more. Of the 32 honorary degrees granted by Albany State University to student activists who were expelled from Albany State College, half of the recipients, 16, went to women of the student movement. And there were many, many more whose names I should remember, and many whose names will never be published in the annals of history. And not to minimize the importance of our brothers in the movement, I would like to take this moment to recognize all those women in Southwest Georgia who were actively involved in the Albany movement or the national civil rights movement. If you're able to stand, please do so, or wave your hand where you sit. And I would like the audience to join me if you would. I know that we've got folk here, all right? I'm looking at them. If you would stand and let us give you a round of applause. These are the women of courage and faith. We often overlook the fact that the official leadership roles in the civil rights movement were reserved to men. At the historic March on Washington in 1963, Josephine Baker was the only female given an opportunity to address what at that time was the largest civil rights protest in the history of the United States. And I understand that that was a last-minute decision because women complained that Marian Anderson was the only woman who had been scheduled to sing before that audience. No woman had been identified to speak. But by and large, it was women who provided the organizational shrewdness to galvanize community and church congregations to stand up and sway public opinion as we marched and demonstrated for freedom. Women formed the lion's share of the grassroots movement. Women organized and participated in boycotts, prayed, sang, and then hurried home to prepare meals and lodging accommodations for other activists. Women were the bread and butter of the movement in more ways than one. Today's session will focus on a special group of heroic women. Even though the Black church was a central and strategic element in the civil rights movement, many churches in the Black community had strict gender-based boundaries that could not be crossed. It was socially acceptable that Black men should be the ministers and lead the congregation, while women would serve as ushers and choir members and be faithful followers. This morning's speaker will highlight some brave and progressive thinkers who believed that their calling to the pulpit was just as strong and just as ordained as the divine calling for the brothers. Our speaker is none other than our own Dr. Chanta M. Haywood. She currently serves as the Interim Vice President of Institutional Advancement at Albany State University. She's a native of Camilla, Georgia, and is the daughter of an ASU alumna, Mary Jo Haywood, who was the first African-American and the first female to serve as mayor of her hometown. I'm not sure if she's here this morning. She was here yesterday and was actually on one of the panels. So Mary Jo, as the first African-American and as the first female of the mayor of Camilla, bestowed so much in her daughter, and she is the same trailblazer as her mom. Dr. Haywood went to FAMU, we'll forgive her for that. She also earned master's degrees in American literature from the University of California at San Diego, and she also got her postdoctorate study at the University of California, San Diego. She joined the faculty of the English department at Florida State University. She received an outstanding teaching award there, and later on she became interim dean of graduate studies at FAMU. She was later appointed dean there and also served as dean of graduate studies at North Carolina Central University. She has a number of outstanding recognitions. Her work has led her to an appointment by the U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, as one of the readers for President Obama's First in the World grant program. She's also a former research scholar at UCLA and Duke, a Mellon Fellow, Chancellor's Fellow, a postdoctoral scholar at UCSD, and she is widely known for the book that she will discuss for us this morning. Prophesying Daughters, Black Women Preachers and the Word, 1823 to 1913. Her book is currently being used as syllabi at Emory University, Wesleyan, FAMU, Harvard, Florida State, Claremont Graduate School, and Indiana University. Please prepare to receive Dr. Haywood, who will conduct our discussion.
She really set me up. I was okay until she started talking about my mom and making the comparisons. I dedicated my book to my mother, and the dedication says, "To Mary Jo Haywood, the wind beneath my wings." She forgave me for going to FAMU too there. You know, Ms. Tucker, you did a very solid job of setting the foundation and setting the context for the roles. Okay, all right. That's okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you. You all can see that Dr. Hill is a true servant leader. You can leave it up there, wouldn't? In fact, that church can stay. That'd be quite nice. Looked like we planned it that way. Dr. Hill, let me first though start by thanking you so much for the opportunity to speak today and to talk about my book. I haven't had the opportunity to have a captive audience, so you all are in trouble for a long time, because this is the research that was the result of my doctoral research at the University of California at San Diego. And I did postdoctoral studies at UC San Diego as well, and studied at the Schomburg and at Duke and other places to gather the data to be able to pull it all together. And while a professor at Florida State, had the opportunity to do some more research to bring it all together, and was able to produce it and teach a number of students, some who I thought would be here today, who were at Florida State, who are professors here at Albany State. Mark and Stephanie Hankerson and Professor Andre Johnson were my students when I was a professor at Florida State. And they took one of my graduate classes on this very subject. So it's really great to have the opportunity to come back to my first passion and my first love, which is literature and scholarship. And then I went into administration, and then something happened. I haven't had time to get back to picking back up on the research. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to begin by sharing with you all something from the preface of the text. When I first read Spiritual Narratives, a collection of autobiographies of 19th century Black religious women published by Oxford University Press in 1988, I experienced a dilemma. It stemmed from my religious dual upbringing in the South. My mother was a Baptist. My father was a Pentecostal preacher, and I participated fully in both churches. Although trying to negotiate the distinct differences in doctrines and styles of both denominations made me experience a kind of religious schizophrenia, one common denominator that presented no conflict in either one of those churches was the role that women were to play in those churches. It was acceptable to be on the usher board. It was acceptable to be in the choir, to be Sunday school teachers, and to play other roles. But it was never within my conceptual view, or even that of my sister, to even aspire to be a preacher. My brother could aspire to be one, and my brother eventually became one. But we were channeled into doing more acceptable domestic roles in the church. So when I began reading the narratives about which I would talk later, I was conflicted. My dilemma was, do I abhor these women who went against what I had been taught in my church and in my upbringing, or do I adore them? Because I was taking feminist theory classes at University of California, and I think that my questioning my dad a lot about women having to stand on the side of the podium instead of in the pulpit began to make him think that my questioning was indicative of how that school out in California was beginning to corrupt the otherwise very good Southern Christian girl. How dare she ask these questions? But I began to have these sensibilities and create this radar, that would just began to make me step outside of myself and my upbringing and become critical of it without giving up on it, because I believed in it. It was in me. And so I decided that I was going to accept that dilemma for what it was, something in and of itself, and deal with it, because there was something for me to explore, and there was a dissertation topic in that, and my professor, Frances Smith Foster, was excited about that. I digested those texts. You know Dr. Foster? Isn't she amazing? Yeah. I digested those texts, and I read them and decided that I was going to read them and study them from what it was that they contributed to and how they challenged African American literary history and literary studies, and how can we use their texts to talk about ways in which there was significant change. This led to another dilemma, because the field of African American literature had very little books, very few books that talked about religious texts the way that I was saying I wanted to talk about them. Something that in them could create theories that students could eventually use to interpret texts. And my last chapter talked about that. And then I want to say that after going through that entire process and producing the text, these women preachers changed my life in ways that my standing here at Albany State is indicative of it. I used an Oprah term. They've allowed me to remember my spirit. Their tenacity and even their audacity have been inspiring and affirming. In the 1800s, these women risked their lives, and they disrupted their families' routines by leaving for months in order to act out their unshakable, I almost said unsinkable, their unshakable belief that they have been called by God to change the world. I can totally relate to their disrupting their family lives, because I commute sometimes, until soon, hopefully. This taught me the importance of defining my own identity and dreams, and then being committed enough to myself to pursue and actualize those dreams. Their lives made me reflect upon the importance of acknowledging the spiritual presence of God in me and using it every day to make my segment of the world better. So I want to thank Dr. Hill again for having me, but in addition to that, I want to thank Jarena Lee, Julia Foote, Mariah Stewart, and Francis Joseph Godet, these women preachers, for their legacy of spiritual strength. So let me just briefly tell you who these women were. Jarena Lee was born in 1783 in Camp May, New Jersey. She was one of the first women that I discussed in the text. She was called to preach. She started having religious inclinations at a very early age. And when someone told her that as a little girl she was being silly and out of her mind, she rechanneled those. And a couple of times she even attempted suicide, because how she had no other place to channel these strong religious inclinations in a societal context that said that you are not supposed to be experiencing that. Go sit down and stop having all of this talk about you're being called by God to preach. But she persisted, and she felt another call, and she went to Richard Allen. How many AME members are in here? She went to Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church, and said to him, I have these inclinations. God has called me. I can't shake it. And other men in the church said to her, we don't accept it, even women. Oftentimes we talk about the men in the church, but a lot of women in the church bought into the same societal notions about what's acceptable in the pulpit. And eventually, Richard Allen was a little reticent, but he later became one of her biggest advocates, even babysitting her child who was very sickly while she went out. But she recalls one time when she was at a sermon and the man was preaching, and she said he was so boring. She couldn't take it. She just jumped up and just began to give that sermon a little bit more fervor. And the people in the audience were appalled at her boldness, but she said there was this supernatural impulse that came over her, and she just couldn't take the fact that he was not expounding upon that scripture with a passion about which she thought he could. Later on, while she was busy preaching, another woman was born. named Mariah Miller in 1803 in Hartford, Connecticut. Mariah Stewart later marries, her name was Mariah Miller, and she later marries a man whose last name is Stewart. And he is telling her over and over again that he doesn't think that she should be preaching as well. So she confronts some challenges with her. Unfortunately, he passes away while he's away at sea, and whites try to deprive her of her inheritance. She later fights the system and wins her husband's inheritance. She became friends with David Walker. Most of you know David Walker from his radical views. He wrote The Appeal that really got a lot of whites at that time a little agitated, kind of like what we've heard, some of the agitation that was going on here in Albany years and years and years later. And he mysteriously died. He was poisoned. He was one of her closest and best friends. And so as a person called to preach, she began to speak publicly, and her religious speaking had an undertone laced with strong social commentary that followed what David Walker was doing and her friend, and continued to have her friend's views promoted. In Schenectady, New York, in 1820, Julia Foote was born to poor parents. Her father was free, but he, just like in 12 Years a Slave, was stolen and enslaved. And so her family was dislocated, as were many black families during this time period. She went on later to marry, and while married, when she was a little girl, she also had religious inclinations that were rechanneled, and where she was told to relax and to calm that down. She later, while married, was called to preach. And I'll talk about that, or I'll give the opportunity during the question and answer period to expound upon some of this if you have those questions. But what was very interesting about her husband is that he told her that if she did not shut up, he was going to have her committed to an insane asylum, because she would jump up as well, and with great zeal and great fervor, she would just get the crowd riled up, and he could not take it, and told her that he would have her committed. Later on, he went to sea, and the moment he left, she went right back to preaching. While he said, well, he's gone. You know, this representation of this patriarchal view that's suppressing me and keeping me from exercising what I know is a call to preach from God as a woman is out of the house right now, and so I'm going to go back. And of course, the word gets out. But unfortunately, while he's away at sea, he dies at war. And then she really resumes her preaching at that time. And then finally, we have Francis Joseph Godet, who was born in Mississippi and who later moves to New Orleans. And she was also called to preach. Her family was living outside of New Orleans. Her grandfather was raising her, and she was, they had to escape to New Orleans because her grandfather, a white male, hit on his wife and accosted her, and he shot and killed him. And as a result, they had to escape, and they went to New Orleans, and that's where she grew up. And while there, she was called to preach. Later on, she channeled her preaching and her call to do prison reform. So what I'd like to do here is to just give you an overview of what I cover in the chapters, and then give you an opportunity to ask questions so that I won't get carried away. But I do want you all to know that I began my study of black women preachers in 1823 with the publication of Jarena Lee's autobiography, and I end in 1913 with the publication of Francis Joseph Godet's autobiography. So collectively, all of these texts cover over a century of material, and it provides tremendous insight into the ways in which Black women during this time period were changing and challenging society and cultural views. These women, it's hard to see, and I'm starting to realize my age. Oh, wow. Wow. I can see clearly now that the light is on. These women who believed that they were called by God to act, they accepted this call, and who did all they could to live up to their call. They wrote their autobiographies as a direct response to this call. They did so in a social context that necessitated a rhetorically strategic use of aspects of the same Christian belief system in which they were converted and which they embraced. They wrote in a context where many of their readers were Christians, yet did not trust the merit of Black self-writers' story. Strict guidelines regarding gender roles restricted women's social and political roles. Prevalent also were ideologies that projected that spiritual and intellectual inferiority of Blacks limited them as well. You have to realize that during and before slavery, well, during slavery, in order to justify it, how could you justify enslaving other humans in a way where you would just have to make them subhuman? And that's what they were. So Blacks were thought to not even have souls. So here you are, a soulless, poor Black woman claiming that really God called you to preach. And this is the environment where they were asserting that they were. Now, what influence would writing as a Black Christian woman in this context have on the choices on what and how to write? How do you prove to a doubtful white Christian reader not only that you do have a soul, but also that you've been called by God to save souls, including theirs? They contend that strongly, that they were calling to convert some of those souls that were running the risk of heading downward. Discussions on how religious views, such as prophesying, dictated and determined the authorial strategies of religious Black women writers in the 19th century have been limited. In some cases where the issue of religious belief has been addressed, it has been examined mainly in terms of its historical and socio-political ramifications. My hope was that when I wrote this book, was that it would map out a few possible ways of understanding how the act of prophesying in the social context of 19th century is used as a rhetorical literary strategy whose implication is evident in the canon of 19th century and for contemporary writers. And I contend that prophesying is not this notion that we think of seeing into the future, but I built upon Cornel West's notions of prophetic pragmatism, where you are called and you see things differently, and you take this, what you see differently, to change things and make life different. So this notion of prophesying in the context that I'm using it is seen as a call to create social change. And that's what these women do. And I call it prophesying because repeatedly throughout their text, when they were confronted with racial ideology, gender ideologies, and others that projected that they had no souls, they all referred to Joel 2:21. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. And that is why I named it Prophesying Daughters. And there's a whole chapter that gets deep into the theory of how I use Jacques Derrida and a whole number theorists to justify what it is that I'm saying in terms of prophesying. So in chapter 3, prophetic change, which was my favorite chapter, Jarena Lee, Julia Foote's use of conversion rhetoric in the context of reader distrust, I discussed how certain notions such as distrust of the white audience, of black women writers, the cult of true womanhood, and ideologies projecting black religious and social inferiority necessitated our politicizing the experience of conversion in order for these women to create a space for them to preach. In other words, they knew that the audience was not going to trust them. They were doubtful. You don't have a soul, you're black. So I'm going to use one of the biggest conversion stories that you all are familiar with, which is Paul's conversion. I'm going to show you how I went through the same thing. And there are all of them write in great detail chapters about their conversion experiences to the letter that mimics Paul's. And they use that to say, just as Paul was converted, so was I. And they strategically use it. In chapter 4, prophetic journeying, the trope of travel in black women preachers' narrative, here I explore the strategic use of the obligation to do apostolic travel as a means to deconstruct 19th century notions of race, class, and gender. And all I'm saying in this chapter, you were called to preach and you were called to travel. They traveled all over the country, all over the world. And just by being in cars, just by being on ships, just by being on trains sometimes, not cars, but carts, with whites, just by being in that space forced them to have to deal with you. And then some would ask, where are you going? Well, I'm going to go preach. And that within itself forced them to have to really deconstruct some notions. And I talk about how their traveling mimics a lot of the apostolic travel that we see in the Bible. So they invert and use stories from the Bible to justify what it is that they're doing in the 19th century. Prophetic reading, which I loved writing, black women preachers and deconstructing biblical interpretation. This particular chapter explores how the idea of prophesying, this notion of using your call to invoke social change, is used to challenge prominent interpretations of the Bible that framed blacks and women in subservient and inferior position. And this chapter is the one that got me in trouble with my daddy. Such notions were the Pauline idea that women should remain silent in the church, and the idea that blacks were the descendants of Ham in the Bible, whose darker generations were cursed to be the servants of mankind. Such projections revealed that in the 19th century, a structure of Bible-based discourse existed and dictated identifications of race, class, and gender. There were ideas based from the Bible that justify why women should be silent, why blacks should be this, and why women should not go places. And so I really, really delve into how they just reversed a lot of this and how they would go and take scriptures themselves and offer their own interpretation, which justified their preaching and their call. Chapter 6, prophetic works, prophesying daughters and social activism. I focus on Francis Joseph Godet. This one touched home for me, and this was a pretty painful chapter to write because on a personal level, we had a close family member who was incarcerated. And I watched my mother fight the system, someone that she raised, fight the system and challenge a lot of things. And Francis Joseph Godet felt as if she had been called to help those who were in prison. So this chapter focuses on the various institutions formed by black women preachers, such as orphanages and schools, their active organizational affiliations, conferences, national women's clubs, and their active participation in social uplift, such as prison reform and education, and finally, their experiences with the politics of publication as religious women. They couldn't publish, they used to have to publish them themselves and go around and sell them. I focus on Frances Joseph Godet, demonstrating by how her creation of the normal school for boys and girls, her national and international crusades for prison reform, and her women's club movement involvements show how Black women preachers lifted society in their climb to live up to their obligation of God. And then finally, can I get a witness? The implications of prophesying for African American literary studies. Now, my publisher told me that I had to write that chapter, so it took a little longer because she said, it was Beverly Jarrett at the University of Missouri Press, you probably know her as well. She said, Chanta, you gotta wrap it up and you gotta make it relevant to future scholars. And so this chapter discusses the significance of these 19th century religious women's texts to the field of African American literature. And I propose that their texts give us insight into a theory of prophesying that aims to offer an alternative way of interpreting literature with strong religious imagery. The formative elements of this concept are drawn from the deconstructive acts that were necessary because these women viewed themselves as prophesying daughters. I delineate the terms under which the text can prophesy or prophesy. I tell you how. So when you're reading Beloved or something from Alice Walker, how does it prophesy? Please don't ask me that today, though. And I conclude with an application of this very notion in Harriet Wilson's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And then finally, in constructing the notion of prophesying, I created a term because, you know, we like to create words. When you're getting your PhD in literature, you make it up if it doesn't exist. And that term that had become pretty popular and was the one that scholars such as Skip Gates, who incidentally invited me, the reason why I was at Harvard, he invited me to come. He had found some texts at the Schomburg, needed someone, and some of them were by Black women preachers. He needed someone to introduce them, and I did. And but when you're doing this research, I realized that this notion of autometography, telling your story of yourself through a metaphysical lens, through a lens of how you see yourself through God's eyes, and then you write your story. That's very different from me just telling the Chanta Haywood story. But if I were to tell the Chanta Haywood story as seen through God's eyes and God's expectations for me, it becomes autometographical. And that's one of the contributions that I made, and it's very comforting to see scholars and young students today using that term in their research. So with that, I'll be so happy to take some questions. Okay, thank you.
I asked the class, so what do you think of women preachers? And this was a female. Well, most of the students were very liberal and said they had no problems with it. But this one female said, I don't think women ought to be preachers. I know women. They don't have any business preaching. And how would you respond to if a student said that in class?
My response to that is that they are continuing, you know, a traditional way of thinking in the church. And a lot of these women preachers confronted that same ideology from men and from women. And these people, when they would go, now let me tell you this, they were not going to Zion and to Shiloh type churches because of the fact that men were not allowing them in the pulpit. They would take alternative routes. So they would preach in bush clearings or in someone's home and or in buildings where they were specifically designated for the purposes of their teaching. So they confronted this very notion that women do not have a place, but they had a following of people who did believe that they do. I wanted to do that so badly. And so the answer is no, I did not. I put it in a footnote that this is something that really needs. So another thing the editor did was to tell me that you're saying too much. Put it in a footnote. But that notion of having no soul is just fascinating, you know, and it's repeatedly, and even to this day, you'd be surprised at the rhetoric out there about blacks and souls, but it's one that was so prevalent throughout each and every one of those texts that I wanted to explore that. I also wanted to explore this notion of attire, what I call acting right and looking right, because they spent a lot of time on making sure that when they left, they dressed a certain way, they appeared a certain way, they appeared godly, they appeared strong, and there was so much emphasis on that. You know, and when you think about issues of femininity and even today, self-identity, there's a whole different disposition and demeanor of women today in terms of how they believe that they should cover their bodies and that it was sacred, and they put a lot of emphasis on that. I wanted to also talk about companionship and partners. Oh, over here, okay. Okay, okay, he'll be next, okay.
Dr. Haywood, based on your research, many of the black female preachers use their journey as a means for social change to uplift their communities. The church today has fallen from that path, and many are saying now that the church is not the central or focal organization to help in many of the causes. Do you think that more women preachers might help change that, or do you have any perspective in terms of how the church might realign itself to be part of that social movement?
I think that's an excellent question, and I want to speak to it from talking about what I saw them doing during this particular context where that's concerned. They were beginning to challenge the church in this way, in these ways too. They were challenging them by not allowing them, they would go to the conferences, some of these women preachers, to the conferences that we all go to annually, and stand out and protest. You know, why aren't women having more opportunities? So there were challenges even then to the church about the role that it was playing in excluding women. And in doing this, you are having a natural impact on society, because if you include us, you know, we can do more. So a lot of women broke off and started their own societies, their own women's missionary societies and women groups that kind of did a lot of these things where they would be taking a leadership role. What does that mean now? I haven't done a lot of research on that, but would be very interested in knowing how contemporary women preachers are addressing this whole notion of the role that the church plays, especially when, having been a part of a class that was and still is excluded, we don't have many. We do have women bishops in some of our denominations, but a lot of women preachers are finding themselves having to become non-denominational or create their own spaces to be able to challenge social ills. Okay. Yes, sir.
Sort of a two-part, I think, or two questions that are sort of related. One.
That means there are going to be like 3 or 4.
No, I'll give you the two. One, Pauli Murray, who in the 40s and 30s, in addition to being a lawyer, would go on to become an Episcopal priest, which raises, listening to you, a question in my mind, who in the mid-20th century would be the progeny of these women. And secondly, and somewhat related, Ella Baker talked about what you talked about a little just a second ago, kind of these women's groups within the church who had a social mission. She used to talk a lot about the influence of these kind of women, and this would have been early in the 20th century. She talked a lot about how these women influenced her thinking in terms of her obligations to the race, as she would put it. And I'm wondering whether that tradition continues in the church.
I can tell you that one of the arguments that one of the women preachers used to make, they used to try to channel them to what I call domesticated positions in the church. Why don't you go be a Sunday school teacher? Something that I saw even growing up. And when they would go to these conferences and challenge the bishops and challenge the organizers, they would even put out there, you know, if these women left, economically the churches would be kind of bad off. Because who comprised the majority of the people in the audiences a lot of times in churches were those women. So they made those arguments. Now, in terms of your first question, that's one that I would like to actually engage and involve the audience on, because it's one that, as a scholar, because I stopped where I did not put as much scholarly and academic research behind that notion. But the first question that you asked was about who is a contemporary person now that we could say is the equivalent to what these women were doing in the 19th century.
I meant really in the mid-20th century. I'm thinking of the 50s and the 60s when you see a surge of activism in the South. When you see a surge of activism in the South, were there women who would be the equivalent of these women you've written about? Then, the only one that comes to my mind, but I'm not a scholar, is Pauli Murray, who was an activist, a lawyer, and ultimately, I think, becomes the first woman to get a doctorate as an Episcopal priest. And if we're talking about those women, would they be in denominations like that, or would they be in the black church?
Explore. In fact, when the Tallahassee Democrat did an article on this book, they went and found women who were preaching and women who had been preaching for years to try to answer that, to try to connect it. But I mean, is there anyone in the audience who knows of contemporary women or women at the beginning of activism who could be identified as someone who would who could be identified as having been the sisters to these prophesying daughters? You know what that sounds like? It sounds like a second book for a graduate student. So I see some students here. Raise your hands, students. That sounds like a research topic, and I would love to mentor you through it. Okay?
What do you feel that their definition of women not having a soul means?
It meant that in order that you didn't have feelings, you didn't have inclinations of human sensibility. You know, you almost couldn't even be humanist to be able to connect to and to be able to identify to this person as a human with emotions and feelings. You were incapable of even doing that. A soul also means something that God was so interested in reclaiming and ensuring that it was pure and sanctified and holy. So you don't even have that basic core of humanity that gives you these religious inclinations. That's what it meant. That's still what it means, I think. I think it's all interconnected, that mind, you're right. Your mind, your soul, these inclinations, these thoughts, your spiritual emotions, all of those things that comprise a soul, and yet they say you don't have them because you're subhuman. You know, in order to have all of those things, you got to be human, and we got to see you as a human, and if I see you as a human, how can I justify enslaving you?
Dr. Haywood, based on your research, what advice would you give a young lady, like maybe one of these young ladies in the audience, who may be hearing a call from God? What would be your advice to them at this generation, how you connect your research to what they're dealing with in their lives today?
You know, my dad contends that I've been called and that I'm denying it. I told them that I was called to teach, not to preach. He begs to differ. But I would encourage these young women, based on what I read, that if you feel a call and you know it's God inspired, just as these women talked about how they couldn't sleep. They couldn't rest. Everywhere they turned, all they could think about was doing something for God, doing something to carry out his mission. If you feel that, you should answer it, and you should utilize it. There were things that I learned from these women's stories that inspire me to this day, and at some point I became almost one with them. It was scary how I think that just as I was thanking them, that they were also thanking me for telling their stories and for talking about how for years them acting out their calls, in certain ways. That's not to say that scholars were not talking about them, because they were. That's how I was able to do a lot of research. But from this perspective, they were pleased that they were brought out of historical obscurity and discussed. And I think it'll be a travesty to young people today who feel called to preach and spread God's words for them not to answer it.
Shirley Caesar is a pastor who started her own church. She kind of changed her denomination she's one of those Baptist-costals. She's in between, and she is,
Baptist-costal.
Baptist-costal.
That would be me. Okay, I didn't know that.
And there are several wives that we reference as first ladies in these churches that aren't actually, they don't have the title as preacher, but they are teachers. And I think they're just using that word interchangeable because they go out as their husbands and teach. And they won't say they're preaching, but they're teachers, and they are making a difference, some of them, in the world. And helping children particularly, young people particularly. But I think there are a lot of present day lady preachers now, but Shirley Caesar comes to mind.
Yeah, and Vashti McKenzie, Bishop Vashti. There are a lot of women who are out there preaching, and there are a lot of denominations that are being more and more open to women preachers. And Shirley Caesar's church in Raleigh, North Carolina, I wanted to attend when I was there in North Carolina. It's pretty powerful, to say the least. But I thank you for that example of someone who's contemporary. I can conclude, if there are no other questions, with some comments that Ms. Nyota Tucker started out with. And that is this, that when you think about civil rights and human rights, what these women preachers were doing in the 19th century, that's at the core of what it was that they were doing. They were advocating for their own rights, but they were advocating for prisoners. They were advocating for the disenfranchised. Angela Davis referenced Frances Joseph Godet a lot because of her prison reform, and we know the work that she did with that. So religious women who were called to preach and then called to change society have historically been involved in civil rights and in social activism. So I do think that we stand on the shoulders of brave women who did indeed make a significant impact on civil rights and human rights and social activism. So thank you, Dr. Hill, and everyone else for the opportunity to share with you. Thank you.
Dr. Haywood, for helping us to understand the intersection of these early Black female ministers and many of the social movements and the desire to deconstruct archaic theories of race, class, and gender. I believe that this concludes the sections that we have scheduled today. I understand that there will be book signings, and we will prepare for that. Dr. Hill, would you like to conclude with your remarks? It's been a wonderful audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Tucker. I would like to conclude by indicating that at 12:30, I believe, Dr. LaRoche will be doing book signing in the rear. I believe the bookstore will come in shortly to set up for that book signing. We'd hope that Dr. Cobb would also bring some books. I don't know that he did. Okay. But I am happy and sad to see this symposium come to a conclusion. Sad that we didn't get to do all of what we wanted to do, just didn't have the time to get it all done. Happy that we were able to do it, and I literally want to thank the president of the university, First Lady, our provost, Dr. Haywood, and her staff, who were very supportive of this process, and the students and faculty and staff at Albany State University who supported by attending and participating in the symposium. We have sort of covered the gamut in terms of activities with civil rights and human rights, and just finished with women's rights. So we think that we have had an important series of activities as part of the symposium, and much of it is due to your attendance and your support of the symposium. So I thank you for that. We'll have our book signing momentarily.